How you doing?
Hi, Nancy. Good. How are you?
Good. Do you want me to test the screen sharing?
That would be wonderful.
Okay. Oh, you've disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, okay. Let me fix that.
All right.
Okay, it should be all panelists now.
All right. Yeah.
Yay! It worked.
Let's see. There we go. Is it showing up with the side panel for you?
No, I think it's just the photograph and then the bottom panel that has your name and the Nature Conservancy logo.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Because on mine it's a split screen, so
Okay.
I don't know how to make that go away on mine.
Yeah, I think at least from my end, it looks like just your presentation.
Okay. Yeah, I guess what it does is it gives you the next slide, so I guess the presenter is ready to go.
Oh, cool. Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Nancy. I'm really excited to hear your presentation. Uh-oh, did I just disappear?
Hey, Jake, how are you?
Good. Pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah. So, Jake, are you with Blue Hill Heritage?
I'm the volunteer coordinator and office manager of Island Heritage.
Oh, okay, good.
Yes.
Right.
My gosh, this weather is just too beautiful, isn't it?
This is the first day where it's actually been warm in probably 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Nancy, where are you joining us from?
I'm sitting in Bath.
Nice.
Yep.
That's...
I have to have like the fresh air window closed because there's too much traffic going by my house on the street here. So I'm gonna have that window open, and it's kind of far away, but that's all right.
Hopefully, at least a slight breeze is coming through for you.
Yes.
We just got a participant saying that it's 92 degrees in Orono right now.
Wow.
Really? Wow, I think it's only 80 here. It's 80 degrees here. That's one of the benefits of being on the near the water.
That's right.
Yeah.
So how many people do you expect to be on the webinar?
We had 27 people sign up.
Nice.
And we have, so far we have 11 participants who have joined us. And
okay.
Oftentimes people will join kind of as we get started and within the first 10 minutes of the presentation.
Yeah.
And I think it's just about 4.
Yeah.
Nancy, do you have any other questions before we get started?
Yeah, just real quick, how long do you want me to talk for versus questions at the end?
Yeah, I think it's been a little bit different depending on presenters, but generally we leave about 10 minutes at the end, but it could be more than that.
Okay.
Yeah, but whatever you have is totally fine.
Yeah, because I think I should be talking for about 40 minutes. Does that sound okay?
That sounds great. Yeah.
Right.
Generally, we tend to run over with questions, so that will give us more time than usual, which will be nice.
Good.
Awesome. Okay, we have 13 people with us. Hi, everybody out there. We can't see your faces, but welcome. Feel free to put your name and where you're from in the chat box and a little word about why you're interested in this topic. I'm super excited about this one because I don't know much myself. This is another Friends from the Field webinar series, part of our Friends from the Field webinar series, co-hosted by Blue Hill Heritage Trust, a community-based land trust for the Blue Hill Peninsula, as well as Island Heritage Trust, which is a land trust for Deer Isle, Stonington, and surrounding islands. We're super excited that you've joined us for this presentation. And I'm gonna let Jake tell you a little bit about the technology in the chat box, and then I will introduce our speaker.
All right, thanks, Lander. I'm Jake, everybody, and I'm so happy to be here on behalf of all of Island Heritage Trust. And I just wanted to point out a couple of features. There's a chat button at the bottom of your screen. You can feel free to tune in with questions as they come up while Nancy presents. We will hold off on the question section for the end of the presentation, 10 to 15 minutes. But if you can't wait and you want to submit your questions right away, Lander and I will try to stay organized and keep track of them for the end of the presentation and ask Nancy. If you'd like, you can also utilize the raise your hand feature at the end, which will allow you to tune in with just your audio or your video and your audio, and you can ask your question to Nancy directly yourself and join in. Other than that, I'll hand it back over to Lander and we'll get started shortly.
Awesome. Thanks, Jake. So Nancy, I just realized I don't know how to pronounce your last name.
Sferra.
Sferra.
Okay. Just like it's spelled.
Sferra. Awesome. Thank you so much. So we're super excited to have Nancy Sferra with us. She's the director of the land management with the Maine Nature Conservancy, and she's going to do a presentation on fire management techniques for ecological balance. Thank you so much, Nancy, for being here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. This should be fun. And a little bit about our land management team. In Maine, we own and manage 300,000 acres across the state. A lot of our large ownerships are in the North Woods. And so I'm going to be talking about the other end of the state today. So we're going to be talking about sites that are primarily in southern Maine, where we have pine barrens habitat that we manage with the use of fire. So getting into the map of where the primary pine barrens are in Maine, these are the 4 largest pine barrens that we have. Fryeburg Barren is part of the Brownfield Wildlife Management Area that's owned and managed by Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. They are getting ready to do some fire management up there, hopefully within the next year or so. But they haven't actually gotten started with extensive fire management up there. Hollis Barren and Killick Pond Wildlife Management Area are next to each other. They're in the town of Hollis. The Wildlife Management Area is owned and managed by the state. IFNW's primary management responsibilities there. And then Hollis Barren is 500 acres that's owned by the Maine Army National Guard. The Nature Conservancy has been burning at Hollis Barren on behalf of the National Guard for the past 20 years or so, 25 years. One of the, it's kind of an interesting partnership because they want the fire management so that it helps them get the site in a condition where they can do training. And we like to burn there because it's good pitch pine scrub oak habitat. And so we both accomplish our goals there by helping them with fire management. And then Waterboro Barrens and Vernon Walker Wildlife Management Area are next to each other. Nature Conservancy owns Waterboro Barrens. Vernon Walker did not show up on this map, unfortunately. I didn't realize it until after I imported it into the document. But that site should be a bigger red blob. There's no burning going on at Vernon Walker, but we've been burning at Waterboro since 2004. And then the site that we've been doing have the longest history of management on it in terms of fire management is at Kennebunk Plains. So there's 2 sites. There's Kennebunk Plains Wildlife Management Area. It's owned and managed by the state. And then the Nature Conservancy owns a small portion of Kennebunk Plains and then owns a much bigger grassland directly adjacent south across Branch Brook from Kennebunk Plains, where we've been doing extensive fire management over the last 30 years. And I'll get into those. The 2 primary sites I'm going to talk about are Waterboro Barrens and Kennebunk Plains. They're similar habitats in many ways, but completely different in many other ways. So those are the sites I'm going to talk about. First, I want to talk a little bit about pine barrens and what's so unique about them. The pine barrens are typically on very deep sand and gravel. Most of our sites have about 90 feet of sand and gravel under the surface. They're very acidic, they're very droughty. And so you have a very small diversity of plants there, but they're really interesting plants. So the primary, can you see my cursor?
I don't think I can. Jake, can you see it?
I see it, Nancy.
I'll just have to talk about which photo is which. So in the lower left-hand corner is a pitch pine. Pitch pines get as far north as Acadia National Park. And they're a relatively rare tree here in Maine, but they have lots of adaptations that allow them to be burned. They have very thick bark, so that bark protects the tree against the heat of the fire. They have these interesting cones that are called serotinous cones. The cones have a waxy surface to them, and the cones will only drop their seeds when the heat of the fire opens that cone up. And it makes sense from an adaptation standpoint because the fire comes through, gets rid of all the duff underneath the tree, and the seeds fall on a surface that's perfect for the germination of the seeds. In Maine, because we have a much longer fire return interval, only about 10% of our cones are serotinous. The rest of them open normally like other pine trees do. The other thing that they have in the photo just above it shows that very fuzzy looking pine tree. The other thing the pitch pines have are things called epicormic buds. And epicormic buds are under the surface of the bark. And when the tree is injured, it will sprout these epicormic buds out so that the tree has more needles that provide for more photosynthesis to happen. And the tree can perhaps survive whatever injury it has, whether it's insects or it gets injured during the course of somebody doing timber management or drought or some other reason why the tree is injured. To the right of that fuzzy pine tree is scrub oak. So scrub oak is one of the dominant shrubs within these pine barrens. Scrub oaks fall out a little bit north of Freiburg, is about as far as they get in the state. And so they're relatively confined to southern Maine. Very fast growing. They never get much taller than about 10 feet, and they never get much thicker than maybe 2 or 3 inches in diameter. So definitely a shrub layer tree. And then right in the center and bottom is gray birch. Gray birch, and for folks who are down east are probably really familiar with gray birch because there's a lot of it down east. Gray birch typically does not get very big, maybe 4 or 5 inches in diameter. It likes to be burned. If it gets top killed, it will resprout and send up many more shoots of the trunk. So it becomes a multi-stemmed shrub. And then there are a whole bunch of rare plant species that are associated, or I shouldn't say rare plant species, but the understory, the herbaceous layers, things like low bush blueberry, poverty grass, little blue stem, rice grass, Pennsylvania sedge or woodland sedge are probably the dominant species that you find in the understory. The flower, the little yellow flower in the other picture is fern-leaved false foxglove, which is one of the rare plants that's found on these pine barrens. So that's just sort of an overview of a pine barren. And in terms of animal species that are adapted to pine barrens and relatively rare in the state, the upper left-hand corner is a whippoorwill, and the upper right-hand corner is the common nighthawk. Both of those species nest on the ground, typically on bare ground conditions. So they like these sort of exposed sand areas. And the one thing that's really important about these sites is that they're relatively big. So we're talking about 2,000 and 3,000 acre sites where one of the biggest predators on these species are people's house cats that are roaming around. And because these sites are big, the whippoorwills and the common nighthawks are buffered against that kind of predation. And then there's a whole bunch of rare moths and butterflies that are associated with these pine barrens. So right in the center is Edwards hairstreak. Edwards hairstreaks feed primarily on oaks, especially scrub oak. The center left is a Barren's buck moth, which feeds on scrub oak. Bottom center is the pine sphinx moth that feeds only on pitch pine. So a lot of these rare moths and butterflies are specialists on pitch pine and scrub oak or blueberry. So they're very restricted in habitat. And then lower right-hand corner, we have a whole suite of shrubland birds that are known from these sites: eastern towhee, prairie warblers, shrubland birds that we don't find really extensively in Maine. So I want to transition to talking about Kennebunk Plains and Wells Barren, because it's really quite different from Waterboro Barrens. Kennebunk Plains and Wells Barrens used to be a blueberry plains. So it was commercially harvested for blueberry up until the late 1980s. And then they abandoned their commercial blueberry operations, moved everything down east. And because of those blueberry operations, and because they had done burning for years and years, it was really good nesting bird habitat, one of the best grassland nesting bird habitats in the state. And so there was a lot of interest in seeing the sites protected. So the nesting grassland birds that we have that are rare at Kennebunk Plains and Wells Barren are the Vesper sparrows in the upper left. Vesper sparrows usually like between 3 and 4 year post-burn habitat. Grasshopper sparrows right there in the center. Grasshopper sparrows like 2 to 3 year post-burn habitat. And then the upland sandpiper, which used to be pretty common in some of the blueberry barrens, but is becoming more and more uncommon, does nest down at Kennebunk Plains and likes anywhere from 2 to 4 year post-burn. There's some other grassland nesting birds. Savannah sparrows are found there, meadowlarks. If we didn't do active management at this site, this would become just like Waterboro, a pitch pine scrub oak barrens, instead of this open grassland. So it takes a lot of effort to keep the site open. Upper right-hand corner is the black racer snake. It's really at the northern limit of its range here at Kennebunk Plains and Wells Barren. So the snake likes sort of low shrub habitat, and there's a hibernaculate at Wells Barren. And so it's really important because as the climate changes, this is at the northern limit of its range, they need to have a good toehold in terms of habitat in order to expand that range as the climate changes. So Kennebunk Plains Wells Barrens is very important for this snake. The other thing I want to point out about Kennebunk Plains, it has the world's largest population of northern blazing star, which is the flower in the lower left and the lower right. So northern blazing star is a liatrous species. Some of you may have blazing stars or liatrous in your perennial gardens. This is our native species. It's rare. It's restricted to these really dry sand plains, loves to be burned. So that picture on the lower right, if you look in the foreground, there's very little northern blazing star. And if you look behind, there's tons. That area behind was burned the year before. And that's what happens when you burn a site. It just flowers profusely. The other thing that burning does, which is really kind of an interesting thing, there are 2 seed predators that feed on the seeds of the northern blazing star and will destroy the seeds. In the absence of fire, if you pick a flower apart and look at the seeds, about 90% of the seeds are destroyed by those seed predators. Following burning, about 30% of those seeds are destroyed. And so it reduces the population of those seed predators and allows for a lot more viable seeds to be released into the environment. So burning has a good role there. So I want to talk a little bit about the conservation history at the site. Kennebunk Plains was, Nature Conservancy purchased 123 acres of a defunct blueberry operation in 1987. And then by 1990, the larger grassland area, 1,041 acres, was purchased by the state. That includes sandplain grassland, pine barrens, and oak pine forest. This was the very first LMF project, Land for Maine Future project, that was done in the state. And then that same year, we did our very first prescribed burn at Kennebunk Plains and have been burning annually there ever since. And then in 2007, Nature Conservancy, after very long, probably 20 years of negotiation, finally was able to purchase the Wells Barren, which was also a defunct blueberry operation. So we purchased 367 acres that hadn't seen active management, including fire, since the early 1990s. In addition, we purchased some buffering land that the Kennebunk Port Wales Water District owns, that sort of buffers the area between Kennebunk Plains and Wells Barren. So looking at a map, unfortunately you can't see my cursor, but the green area is all the Nature Conservancy property. So the upper green, bright green area is the original Kennebunk Plains, and then the lower central green area is Wells Barren, and then everything in yellow is Kennebunk Plains, that's owned by the state. And then the light green off to the west and north of Wells Barren is all Kennebunk Port Water District, Wells Water District. And if you see there's a stream that runs between the green and the yellow, that's Branch Brook. And if you could see the topo lines between that run down towards the stream, it's really interesting soil configuration going on there, where there's 90 feet of sand and gravel. It's an outwash plain. Water percolates down through that sand and gravel and hits a clay layer, moves laterally along the clay layer, and then comes out on those slopes above Branch Brook and help recharge that stream. That slope is known as an outwash seepage forest, and it's a rare natural community in the state in its own right. So it's a very interesting configuration of very cool habitats. We have a really good relationship with the water district. So between the three, Nature Conservancy, the state, and the water district, we have a lot of the same objectives for these sites. Didn't know I had animation. So just to talk a little bit about what we do when it comes to fire management, we have to have a fire management plan that has an ecological justification for why we would do burning, because burning is expensive, it's risky, and you need lots and lots of training in order to have a crew who can do the burning. So we go through the same training that federal employees go through in order to be able to be on either a wildfire or a prescribed fire. So we go through the same training standards that they have. This is the Conservancy as a whole. And we transitioned to that about 20 years ago because of the risk of fire, how risky fire is. So we have to have an ecological reason to want to do burning. And at Kennebunk Plains, we have three things we want to do. We want to maintain sand plain grassland, so we burn about every 4 years. We want to be able to promote the flowering northern blazing star. We want to retain little bluestem, poverty grass, lowbush, blueberry, and pincherry for the moths and butterflies. And we want to make sure we have really good grassland nesting habitat. We also want to create some low shrub areas. These are areas where the shrub's less than 4 feet in height, and that's good for black racers, and it's also good for the moths and butterflies, but it's also good for the prairie warblers, the eastern towies, the brown thrashers that all nest there. And then we also want to have these high shrub areas where basically we burn every 6 to 10 years. We create these multi-stemmed gray birches and scrub oak, and it's really good habitat for all those other shrubland bird species that we have out there. And so these are our management objectives for Kennebunk Plains. Other things we have to think about when we do a fire management plan are things like smoke management and contingencies. So if the fire gets away, what do we do? Every burn that we do has to have a burn plan for that specific burn, and it has to have a certain components in it. Things like, what is the weather that you're going to have on the day that you burn? So the temperature range, the humidity range, which direction the wind's going to blow from. If we send the smoke in the wrong direction, we'll get a lot of complaints, and so we try not to do that. We do smoke screening on everything. So are there hospitals or nursing homes or schools downwind from the site that we're burning? So we do this whole analysis of where that smoke's going to go. We also input all the temperature, all the weather parameters, and it spits out into a program. And it spits out an estimate of what the burn is going to do, how fast is it going to spread, how tall are the flames going to be. And so this all goes into our burn plans and our fire management plan. So at Wells Barren, one of the first things we had to do, because it hadn't been managed at all for 20 years, the shrubs and trees were too tall for us to safely burn that site. And we wanted to convert it to back to grassland. If we didn't go in and do a full-scale cutting operation in there, it would have taken us forever to get it back to a grassland situation that would benefit the species we wanted to have there. And so we hired a forester and a logger to come in, and they basically clear cut what was formerly the grassland, the blueberry operations. They didn't expand it at all. But we basically went in and had everything clear cut, chipped up. They hauled it to a biofuel plant in New Hampshire, so none of that woody material stayed on the site. And it allowed us to create vegetation and fuel structure that was safe to burn. So we did that in 2016. And then by fall of the next year, we did our very first prescribed fire at Wells Barren. And it's hard to tell from this photo, but the duff layer out here, because it hadn't been burned in so long, there was a lot of fuel on the ground here. It burned really well. And you go back out today and look at it, and it looks really nice now that we got that first burn in place. We'll go back and probably burn this again in another 2 years. But we have been burning every year since then. So this just gives you an idea of what it looks like when we do a burn. And those flames that are that you see are being pushed by the wind towards the left. And so you can see that the flame lengths are not very big for a burn like this in a grassland situation. So one of the things we have to do is go out and see, is the work that we're doing, is the management that we're doing really doing what we want it to do? And so every year I go out and I do point counts at Wells Barren, where I go and visit each one of these points and count birds for 10 minutes. I visit 3 times during the season. So this is just a map of the birds that I found this year. I haven't sort of analyzed data yet in terms of how many territories there are, but it was nice because we do have an upland sandpiper, only one that I can tell. We have at least 3 grasshopper sparrow territories, lots of towhees, brown thrashers, lots of prairie warblers, some vesper sparrows. So things are happening the way we want them to. We've probably only burned about half of this site so far. So we have a lot more restoration to do. But we're using the bird population as sort of a indicator to us of whether or not our management is doing what we hope it to do. So the other thing that we're doing is, and this photo was not obviously taken at Kennebunk Plains or Wells Barren. We're putting out, this was taken up on our sugar bush up on the St. John lands, but we're putting out things called song meters. They look like a game camera, but they have really good stereo microphones on them, and they're basically out there to record the bird songs that are on the site. So we put these out for a month. They record for 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours at night. We want to do the nighttime recording because we want to get things like whippoorwill, common nighthawk, owls. Sometimes we get coyotes. It basically will record everything that you hear out there. So like on the upper St. John, we have moose walking by the song meters, and that we get that in the recordings. And there's a software package that will take your recordings and sort of analyze it. You have to do some machine learning with it to tell it what the birds sound like. But once it knows that, it can sort of figure out how many of each species you're finding on the plots. So we put 3 out this year, and I just collected them the other day because I wanted to make sure I had some results to show you what it looks like. But for every recording that we do, it does a WAV file. So basically just a audio file, and you import that into the software, and it does a spectrogram of what the bird songs look like. After a while, after listening to it and looking at the spectrogram, it's pretty easy to start picking out what the birds what the birds are by what they look like on the spectrogram. But I thought I'd just show you what in this little segment, this is not a very long segment of the recording of what it looks like. So we got eastern towhees, field sparrows, prairie warblers, wild turkeys, and brown thrashers all in this recording. And the brown thrasher, even though I just have it at the end there, actually is, you can hear it all the way through. Hopefully this will work. I'm going to play it for you. Are you hearing that?
Unfortunately, not hearing it from my end.
Ah, I wonder if there's something I have to do with the audio.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. Is your audio all the way up?
Yeah, I can hear it really well on my end. I know there's an audio setting in Zoom somewhere.
Oh dear. Yeah. We've had a few people.
Let me see if I can pump up my audio, and maybe you'll hear it through my microphone.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks for trying.
That totally takes the fun out of it.
The visual's pretty cool too, though.
Well, it sounds really cool. Well, sorry about that. No. I know there's something on, oh wait, hang on. Sorry, I don't see anything. I think there's a way to share your computer audio, but I can't find it. All right, too bad. Sorry.
Thanks for trying, Nancy. And if you have a link that you wanted me to send out to people who are—
What's that?
If you have a link to it that you want me to send out in a follow-up email to everybody so they can experience it and hear it, we can try that as well.
Okay, I will do that. All right. So the other thing we're doing, there is a big program in the Northeast to look at pollinators in these dry habitats, pine barrens and sandplain grasslands. And so a couple times a month we go out and put out these bee bowls. They're different color bowls with detergent in them, soapy water in them, and the insects, the pollinators are attracted to the soapy water. And we also do some sweep netting. And we're collecting this, sending it down to a lab in Maryland, and they're documenting all of the native pollinators that are found on these dry sites. So we're doing that at Wells Barren too. So now I want to transition over to Waterboro. Waterboro is a much different system, you know, than Kennebunk Plains. Kennebunk Plains is on this outwash sand plain, so it's relatively flat or gently rolling. Waterboro Barrens is on ice contact deposits, so it's moraines and kames and kettle holes, and so there's very topography. It's very steep in places, but it still has that very deep sand and gravel. And if you look at this map, our preserve is in orange, and if you look at the yellow on the map, that's where there's this Adams soil that supports pine barrens. So that's where the extent of the pine barren is. And this is an interesting site because we have a lake down here, a lake at the side. You don't see my cursor. Lake at the bottom. It has houses all around it. That little circular incursion in the west side of the preserve has houses all around it. And then the other lake up in the northwest has houses all around it. So we have a lot of people living next to this preserve that we have to worry about in terms of if there ever was a wildfire in here, we'd worry about where that fire went. And so we want to do fire management for ecological reasons, but also to reduce the fuel for the surrounding communities who all live in pitch pine scrub oak habitat. So the conservation history here, in 1992, we bought 1,100 acres that was slated for subdivision. And then in 1993, we bought the remaining subdivision. So 2,000 acres of what was going to be houses was purchased. And then over the intervening years up till 2014, when we did our last protection addition to the preserve, we did an additional 11 tracts of 503 acres. So this is a pretty big site, 2,500 acres of habitat. We started forest thinning operations to reduce fuel in 2003 and our first prescribed burn in 2004. And one of the things I wanted to show was how we prepare to do burns out here, because we just can't go and burn it, because we would never be able to hold that fire in what we say inside the box, so in the unit. And if you look at this photo, the photo on the upper left, I pulled that off of Google Earth, and you can see some sort of squiggly lines that go through the center of the picture. Basically, that's where we did thinning to create these bigger, wider fire breaks at this site so that we could burn it safely. And then we did the same thing right next to all of those houses. So we're creating what's called a wildland urban interface. And the lower right-hand corner just shows what that looks like. We want to get very little fuel on the ground, towards the ground, so that when the fire comes through, it'll just drop to the ground and not get up into the treetops. And we want to space the trees apart enough so that the fire can't jump from treetop to treetop. And so that's how we do our initial treatment of the site. Here our ecological objectives are to create a diversity of pine barrens, natural communities, increase the structural diversity, and use a combination of mechanical and fire to do our treatment. We want about 300 acres of pitch pine scrub oak woodland that has less than 60% canopy closure, so more of an open habitat. We want about 100 acres of just pure scrub oak without very much canopy, pitch pine canopy. And then we want to maintain about 50 acres of open sort of blueberry grass habitat, so that we have some early successional habitat out there. We want to make sure we burn patchy so that we're not impacting our butterfly and moth populations. And we want bare ground for nesting whippoorwills and nighthawks. And then we also want to prevent the encroachment of mesic species like white pine, which does not like to be burned, and red maple, which also doesn't like to be burned. So I just wanted to show you some photos of what it looks like to burn out there, because it's a much different burn than what we do at Wells Barren. So if you look at the lower left-hand photo, that's about what the fire looks like when we're burning out into those cut strips that I showed you. The burn is relatively low flames, easy to control. On the right-hand side, that's what it looks like when it's burning into the scrub oak. Maybe not with any canopy above it, but into the scrub oak. You're now getting into 5-foot flames. It gets much more intense than that. And then the upper left-hand corner is what sometimes happens in the middle of the burn unit, where we might get torching of individual pitch pines. Pitch pines can survive a lot of fire. So it's pretty interesting how much pitch pine will survive some of that. But that pitch pine that's going up in flames in that photo is probably not going to survive. We don't want to do much of that, but every once in a while it happens. So that's what burning looks like at Waterboro. We're burning about 40, 50, 60 acres at a time out there. And then it sometimes takes us 4, 5, 6 days to actually put the smoldering out. So we have to stay with the fire for that number of days and make sure it's fully extinguished before we quit babysitting the site. So it's pretty intense work. We usually have a crew of between 12 and 20 people helping us on a burn like that. And we have our own fire engines and all the equipment that you need to do that kind of work. So that's what it looks like at Waterboro Barrens. So I'd love to open it up to questions.
Nancy, thank you so much.
Sure.
That was wonderful. So fascinating. We already have one question in the chat box. See if I can find it. Okay, it's from Sandra, and she said, is the Hollis Barren open to the public? How about Waterboro? Any information about how and where to access?
Yeah, so Hollis is kind of open to the public. I think you can walk in there. They've sort of gated it off because they used to have a lot of issues with ATVs in there. And I remember a long time ago when we were doing some moth and butterfly surveys for them down there. This is like the mid-90s. I think there were 40 burned out cars in there, and they got the site all cleaned up, so they don't have that issue anymore. So it's kind of open to the public, and then the surrounding land that IFNW owns is open to the public too. I don't think they really have hiking trails there. At Waterboro, it is open to the public. If you, I think if you went to Google Maps, it would get you there. There's a parking lot off of Round Pond Road, and actually I think the information is up on our website too. So we allow hiking, and you know, there are people that are illegally taking their ATVs in, but it's a really great place to go hiking. Really interesting site, and there's a lot of old woods roads that we use for fire management that people can walk on, so it's pretty nice area. We don't allow dogs, so I will just warn you that.
Thanks, Nancy. We had a question from Peter. How have the burning regulations changed during your time at TNC?
So that's a great question. When I did my very first burn with the Nature Conservancy, I was actually working in Michigan at the time. We would call up the burn, the local fire department, get a burn permit, and we'd have a burn plan, but it was pretty simple, and we didn't have like a fire engine. We just sort of went out there and lit it on fire, and we would have, we had Nomex and everything, which is the fireproof gear, that the clothes that we wear. But you know, we really didn't have all that much gear, and never really had an issue. But we weren't doing burns like we're doing today. Now we have to have 2 fire engines on site, so one in reserve in case something goes wrong with the first one. We oftentimes will have 4 fire engines on site, so 2 that are on the back of a pickup truck, so they're built as fire engines. You don't take the tank off or anything, it's all on a sort of flatbed pickup truck. And then 2 that are on UTVs. So we typically have 4 engines on site, and sometimes our partners will bring engines. It is much harder to be a burn boss now because we go through the federal standards. I used to be certified as a burn boss, and I lost my certification just because I didn't have time to keep up with it. But when I got certified, I didn't have to go through the same training they go through now. And we now carry risk insurance, where every chapter that does fire management pays extra insurance to make sure that we're covered for our risks.
Awesome. Thanks, Nancy. We have a lot of amazing questions coming in. Thank you, everybody, for contributing. Next up is Ruth's question. How large a section can be burned without causing too much distress to wildlife? Is that managed by burning at particular times of year?
Yeah, that's a really great question. At Kennebunk, we try to burn, we don't burn during the time when the nesting birds are on territory. So we try to get our burning done usually mid-April to mid-May, and then we'll start burning again in August after the birds have fledged. At Waterboro, because the humidity is so high in the middle of the summer too, that makes it harder to burn. Although burning at Waterboro in the middle of summer is much more easy to control. because of that humidity and the moisture in the vegetation. We try not to burn. So at Kennebunk, in any given year, we try not to burn Kennebunk and wells no more than 25% of the entire grassland in any year, because we want to make sure that there's refugia for the moths and butterflies to move back in. There's enough habitat for the birds to be able to find enough space to nest. And then at Waterboro, we really can't do anything more than 40 or 50 acres at a time, just because it's really intense work and it takes us a long time to do the mop up after the fact. So we're trying to make sure that we're not burning really huge areas at a time. Realistically, the bigger the unit that you're doing, the easier it is to burn, because the dangerous part is the edge of the burn. Once you get out in the middle, you can just let it rip. I don't want to be so, so, oh yeah, let it rip. But, as soon as you have everything blackened off, it's much easier to finish the unit. So the bigger unit you have, the faster it goes. There are places out in, with the Nature Conservancy out in the Midwest where they're doing 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 acres at a time.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible. Thank you, Nancy. The next question is from Randall. What's the latest drought forecast due to climate change for this region, and how will it impact the biodiversity of the fire regime?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, and I wish I knew the answer, because it seems like every time I turn around, the projections are changing. But from what I understand is we're supposed to be getting wetter, but it's going to be coming in more intense storms. And so instead of being like right now, I mean, it's dry out there right now for this time of year, and instead of being sort of through the space through the season, we're going to be getting more intense storms. And my expectation is that we're going to see more summertime drought. We've seen that the past 3 or 4 years. And if that's the case, it's going to be more and more likely that we're going to have more wildfires in Maine. This year, they've already had quite a few wildfires. We had one on one of our preserves last week that luckily, and it was from a campfire, so it's people being careless, which is really unfortunate. But I think there's going to be a lot more wildfire potential in Maine. The good thing in Maine is that there are more and more people who are becoming trained to be able to fight wildfires or do prescribed burns. And so I think that's really good.
Cool. Awesome. Next up is Rebecca's question. She says, great presentation. And then how did you determine the acreage of area for each cover type at Waterboro?
Yep. We used, one of the things that we did is early on when we got the preserve, there's a really good fire ecologist that works at a University of Massachusetts. And we asked him to look at some of the historic data. So he was able to get air photos back into they took air photos right after the 1947 fire. So he's able to look at air photos from 1947 to, at the time he did this work, was the early 1990s. And he was able to map sort of the configuration of the fuel out there. So how much of it was in, just scrub oak, how much of it was in this open pitch pines with scrub oak underneath, how much had closed canopy. And then we also in Waterboro have this really cool habitat type called a pitch pine heath, where it's pitch pine and blueberry and no scrub oak, which is, it's really kind of, it's a striking habitat type. And so we used the data that he compiled on sort of the configuration of the last 50 years to think about how we might want to configure our the habitat types that we want. And it's not set in stone either. We don't always know what we're going to get from the burns. And so in some cases we may burn a site thinking that we're going to kill 20% of the pitch pines and we'll have this nice woodland, and we may not meet that objective with the burn. And sometimes it'll take 2 or 3 burns in order to get to that end point.
All right. So the next question for you, Nancy, I think is coming from Sandra, and I believe she's referencing one of the maps you put up, and maybe you'll be able to know exactly what she's talking about. She's asking, what road is the access for Hollis off of? I don't see it an easy access point.
Yeah, actually, the map I have won't show it because the scale's too bad. It's off of, so if you take Deer Pond Road, I think it is, or 117, it's near where Deer Pond Variety used to be. I don't even know if that store is still there. So 117 or Deer Pond Road, and then Hardscrabble Road is the dirt road that goes off to I think it would be to the east from there, is where the way that you get into the Hollis site. And if you find, if you find the Poland Spring plant in Hollis on Plains Road on the map, it's right across Killick Stream from there. That's not how you get in, but that's how you can pinpoint it on the map.
Cool. Thanks for clarifying, Nancy. We have a question from Susan Guilford. Should Maine prioritize more fire management to maintain habitats? Is any other agency or organization doing what the Nature Conservancy is doing? And should Land Trust consider controlled burns on any sites?
Yeah, so it's really nice because working with the state, we've just created a Maine Fire Council. So it's got members of the state, so the Maine Forest Service, IFNW, TNC, there's, I'm trying to think of who else is involved, but the federal agencies are involved in this fire council. And one of the purposes, it's a prescribed fire council. And one of the purposes is to try to increase the number of people who are trained in Maine. We put on, and this year it got messed up because of COVID, but we put on what's called a red card training every year to get new people trained to at least be on a fire crew. So you can help out with people, the fire crew can help out with just being on a holding crew, and as long as they pass the physical fitness test, they can be on our crews. So we're trying to increase the number of people who are trained to do prescribed fire. The state, so Maine Forest Service had really been just a suppression agency. That's really changed. There are many people at Maine Forest Service now who are interested in prescribed fire. Inland Fisheries and Wildlife is now interested in doing more prescribed fire. And so it's becoming more and more a tool. They do, for instance, burning on Swan Island in Richmond, IFNW does. They do some burning down at Scarborough Marsh. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does burning. Moosehorn Refuge. Rachel Carson was doing some burning. I don't know how much they're doing now, but some of the National Wildlife Refuges are doing some burning. It's not a lot. So I think in the whole state, we're lucky if we do 300-400 acres a year. So it's not a lot of burning, and we don't have a lot of fire maintained habitats in Maine. I think that we're getting there. And then some of the land trusts do have an interest in burning. So Brunswick Topsom Land Trust has done one burn on one of their sites, and I just work with them and their contractor on. I just reviewed another burn plan for them, so they hope to have Maine Forest Service help them do a burn. Probably won't happen this year, but hopefully next year on some blueberry land.
That's really interesting. Nancy, you may have already mentioned this, so forgive me, but just as a follow-up to that question, is there a maximum number of acres that you need to have in order to use fire as a management tool?
No, although I would say that, if you're doing a really small area and you don't really have a good, from an ecological standpoint, a good reason for doing the burns, then it's probably not a good idea to do them. But for instance, some of these, and sometimes, there are roles for small experimental burns, just to see maybe how the fuel is going to burn. So, there are some opportunities. One example I can think of, we have a preserve up in Crystal called Crystal Bog. And it has a federally rare plant on it that is the only population anywhere in the Northeast is in Crystal, Maine. There's about 15 plants of this particular species. Everything else is out in the Midwest, and it likes to be burned. So we're working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to think about doing some really small burns at this site, and it may be just patches that might be 10 feet by 10 feet, just enough to get some of the thatch burned off so that these really fine seeds of this plant can settle on that burned area and hopefully germinate and produce more plants, because it's just barely hanging on at 15 plants. So
wow, that's so interesting. Well, do we have any other questions? We have a couple minutes left.
I don't see any other questions. Lander, did anybody want to use the raise your hand feature and ask Nancy any? I guess now would be the time if anybody wanted to ask Nancy a question directly, or you could tune in with just your audio as well. So maybe we'll just take our time and wait 2 or 3 minutes and see if any other questions roll in.
That sounds good. I'll keep an eye out for little blue hands.
Okay. Sounds good. Sounds good. Nancy, I had just kind of a question about what's the furthest north that you've burned to your record in your career?
Well, probably, in Maine, probably Hollis.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. It's really interesting. So we have a property called Big Reed Forest Reserve. It's the largest virgin forest in the Northeast. And we had somebody do a natural disturbance study there. And so one of the things he was looking at was charcoal in the soil. And by looking at the charcoal layer, you can sort of determine what the fire history is. He found that the return interval there is, like an astronomical number of years. So, they called Maine the asbestos forest because it just doesn't burn very much. And so once you get into northern Maine, there's really not that much burn history. The biggest burn, what you get is when there's a big spruce budworm die off. You might have had a burn happen after that. In southern Maine, a lot of the origins of fire were railroads. So the fire history wasn't very intense until we built the railroads, and then the sparks and embers from the railroads are what set these places on fire, or early land clearing. So
we do have one hand raised. I'm going to allow Susan to ask a question. Susan, I think you might need to unmute.
Okay, here I am.
There you go.
Okay, thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Lander. So I'm thinking about the Surrey Forest, which is a 2,000-acre parcel that's here in Surrey, on the Blue Hill Peninsula. And it's recently been logged, and it's growing back. And in the past 3 years, I've been in there at night. And there are lots of nighthawks, and there are, well, I've only found one whippoorwill at a time, but it's a special habitat. And I'm wondering if there's anything that a land trust should think about doing to try to preserve that might involve fire.
Yeah, so what's the primary vegetation in there?
Well, it's growing back. There's a lot of gray birch, as you said, and sweet fern and that sort of thing.
Yep. Yeah. So I think that so one thing I would say is in some places where there's a lot of exposed ledge, and we have a couple sites down east where there's some sites that just tend to have open areas on their own. I think the nighthawks can do pretty well because they find places they can nest. And I think with something like gray birch, it can also be managed mechanically. And so it'll respread on its own. So I guess the big question is whether or not, just because of the amount of equipment you need and the training you need to do fire, whether you can accomplish the same thing with cutting that you would with fire. Now, one of the things you don't get with cutting that you get with fire is a different nutrient cycling, because the ash that gets deposited into the ground, and so the nutrient cycling is different, and you also don't get the compaction of the soil that you might get with timber management. Many of the sites down east have, do have a history of fire, because they tend to be a little droughtier than what we have in the central north part of the state. So it wouldn't be out of the ordinary to think about doing fire in some of those sites.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks for asking that question, Susan. Lander, do we have anybody else lined up?
I think that might be it. I don't see any more hands, and I think we're coming to the end of the questions in the chat box, and we're just right on time, really. It's 4:58. So
good planning.
Yeah, worked out really well. Thank you so much again, Nancy, for joining us this evening, and we'll send you a recording of the webinar if you'd like to share it with your community as well. And
awesome, and I'll send you that WAV file of what was on, and you can share it with people. So
that would be so lovely. Yes, I will put it in the follow-up email so everyone who joined us today can take a look at it, and those people who couldn't make it but want to view the recording will be able to see it as well. Yeah, so thank you so much, and I'm just going to put in a plug for next week. Next Thursday at 4 p.m., Peter Curtis is going to be talking to us about lady slippers, ecology, and conservation. So if you want to register for that, you can go to our Facebook or our webpage, both Island Heritage Trust and Heritage Trust. Thank you all for joining us.
thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Great to meet you, Nancy.
Yep. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Have a good night.
You too.